I'd like to welcome you all to a set of 4 lectures on Black history that we're doing throughout Black History Month. This set is being presented by Abu-Bakr Madden Al-Shabbaz. He's a visiting lecturer at Cardiff University, and he does a whole variety of other jobs. And I suppose I've got to know him through just local community action and the kind of introducing or reintroducing Black history into education and making education multicultural. To kick off the series, I'd like to invite Vice-Chancellor Colin Reardon just to welcome you all and to open this series.
Hello, thanks very much indeed, Abid, and thanks for the opportunity for doing this. I'm very pleased to be able to be here and to attend this evening. First of all, can I just say how enterprising it is of the Student Race Equality Steering Group to put this series on. I think that gives a very strong signal that our students are committed to this agenda and that they are able to take action to move things forward. And I think that's really important, because one thing that I've discovered over the years, that if you want to bring about change, you need first of all to listen to the people who are who actually have experience of what it is you're trying to change, and you need for those people to be empowered to take action. And I hope that's what's happening with our Student Race Equality Steering Group, and I'm really grateful to all the members of that group and Abid for his role in that as well. It's an extremely important set of topics that our speaker today, Abu-Bakr, is going to be tackling here. I mean, I heard recently something on the radio about Black history in Britain and how it's been rather eclipsed by the history of the civil rights movement in the US, and clearly that's an issue that has come to the fore in recent years, and indeed even in recent months, the lack of awareness of Black British history, and in some cases the erasure thereof. But you know, there are things happening, and there are people working on this, including Abu-Bakr, of course. But I think the point I want to make is that you don't have human history without African history, because human history really starts in Africa, and human history in many senses is African history. So I think this series of lectures is incredibly important in that respect. Bonnie Greer recently wrote about breaking down the mythologies of Black history to get at the truth, because without truth you can't have truth and reconciliation. And so in that respect too, this is very important, and Black History Month is key to all of that. So I think we are very happy to have Abu-Bakr here with us, highly expert, highly experienced in helping to put all this right by presenting a series of lectures of this nature. So I'm delighted that you're here with us, Abu-Bakr, to do that, and so that we can all support Black History Month in Wales in this way. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin.
Okay, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thanks for turning up. It's been a wonderful thing. First of all, I'd like to thank Cardiff University for inviting me. I have a passion for Cardiff University. This is where I did my undergraduate studies to become a social scientist. My background is in child development, child psychology, education, anthropology. As far as Black history, Black and African history is concerned, that was just a personal passion of mine. I've been studying history for about 46 years by the time I was 7 years old, because I lived in a particular time at Cardiff. I come from a Jamaican family. I grew up in Cardiff. And what I started noticing was, when I was a young child, that the colonial narrative was still, strong. That Africans lived in trees and we had tales, these type of things I grew up with. But what was quite confusing for me, that if Africa was a jungle, why is it that white people are actually living in Africa? This is a question I ask myself. Why are they living in, Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe? Why they were living in Kenya and in Ghana and all these other places? It didn't make sense. Why are you telling me or telling us that Africa's a jungle, but yeah, you want to live there, you want to migrate there? Many of them even want to move back. So I started to ask myself these questions at the time I was 7, 8 years old. And then I started to find out that African history, by the time I was 8, 9 years old, and I'm obviously reading the Bible as well, because I came from a Christian family, I started to realize that the first chapters of the Bible was African history. And I started to realize that Africans were the oldest people on the planet at the age of 8. Obviously, that didn't go down too well with the schools. But the reality is that I was looking more at the positive aspects of Black history. I also like to thank Cardiff University as well, because while I was an undergraduate student, they knew about my passion, etc. And what they decided to do, they decided to send me on a teacher training course so I can come back once I've left, be in my undergraduate studies, to teach my passion, which was Black and African history. And I have got, you know, passion and a love for Cardiff University. I hope you have too. They've really helped me in my career. You know, even though I didn't have a PhD or nothing, when I was, you know, I was going to teach some high level stuff, they trusted me and they allowed me to do that. And most lecturers who are doctors and professors were not really allowed in some departments to teach outside their fields, but they allowed me to do that. So as far as race relations concerns, as far as mobility and personal development, Cardiff University have definitely cultivated me. And I'm so happy that I'm here doing this with you as students, and many of you work within different faculties. Thank you very much. So the presentation I'm going to do today, I'm going to touch on some things I'm going to be doing in the coming weeks, but I'm not going to touch too much on that. I want to leave that to people. You know, I want to leave that to people to be a bit hungry, you know, to come back next week. But the thing is what I'm going to look at things from a sociological perspective. I'm also going to look at things from a historical perspective, some basic things, some contemporary things, just to get things going. Right, so what we're going to do here, we're going to look at history, how history is formulated, how history is formed. History is based upon two basic principles, time and space. Time is chronology and space is geography. This is the first thing we need to understand. So you have what is known as figurative information, okay? And then you've got what is known as like qualitative information. So some information when you deal with history is written with a script or with words, and others are based upon figures. And this is how history comes together when you're looking at time and space, when historians themselves are using these basic principles in order to develop a basic understanding about the past, about the present, and about the future. Okay, so what I have here, time is based upon number sequences known as figurative information. So it's about figures here, okay? And space looks at direction, okay, which is geography. And I'm going to show you how all these things come about, because there is a system to history, historiography, historicity. It is a system behind that. You know, it has principles, it has foundations, etc. And these are just some of the basic things I'm going to go through in this presentation. So when we look at time and space, between time and space comes a narrative. It looks at events, what actually took place. So time, like I said, is chronology, is figurative information, space is geography. But what is important here, when we're looking at the narrative, this is where the qualitative and quantitative data comes together. That synthesis allows us now to interpret a particular event. This is what this is about. So like I said, time is quantitative in its data, in its findings, in its outcomes, and space is qualitative, based upon good, wholesome information. But when the narrative comes at the center of that, it synthesizes the two. So here is just an example of what history is. History is based upon time and space. So if you look at the left-hand side of the screen, you've got time, which looks at duration, areas, era, a period, moments, years, dates, months, years, etc., etc. This is figurative information. So when we're looking at that, we're looking at the time or the chronology, as to speak. We're looking at when it took place. When did this event take place? When? Okay, this is what it's about. You know, when in the ancient world, they built observatories in order to understand the planetary systems, the cosmology of the universe, because this is how they're going to regulate themselves as well as time. In the red box here, even though it's not considered element of time, it is figurative information, statistics, wealth, money, the economy, etc. So basically, it's all about using numbers. And we use numbers in everything that we do without sometimes even realizing it, from telling the time, you know, until, you know, changing something over on the television on the remote control. We use numbers every day, sometimes without even realizing it. Now, when we're dealing with space, which is geography, these are some of the things that we look at when we're investigating people or people's society. So here, for instance, you've got place, era, or area, region, town, city, county. You see all those things there. So for instance, how are we going to bring this thing together? So for instance, if I was looking at a date, I would look at, just throw something out, 1066, okay? Battle of Hastings. That would be a date. And then what would happen then? Oh, I can use this, yeah, brilliant. So you got the date, and I would want to connect that to something. What happened in 1066 in a particular village? Okay, what happened in 1066 in a particular city? This is how these things come about. So what you will find, they will cross each other in one way or another. This is where the qualitative and the quantitative information comes together. So when we look at history, we always have to ask ourselves, historians or students of history, the 5 or 6 principles: the who, what, why, when, where, and how. And there's always going to be 2 narratives to that. There's going to be a subordinate, and there's going to be a subordinate narrative and a dominant narrative. A dominant narrative is usually by people who were victors, who defeated a particular group, people, an army, whatever the case may be. But there's also another narrative. One of the unfortunate things about history is that history seems to focus itself on an official narrative. And an official narrative is usually what is constructed socially, politically, legally by the winning class or the winning group. So a good historian looks at 2 aspects of a society. It looks at those who are for and those who are against. Because in ancient African societies and ancient African civilizations, one of the things that we come to realize, they believed in what was known as the principles of polarity. They believed in the laws of opposites. So what that means is that 2 opposites are not supposed to go through conflict. We're supposed to reduce conflict. Male, female, not male versus the female, boy, girl, up, down, left, right, hot, cold. This is how the ancient African societies from the beginning of time understood things. Things in pairs. And within the field of sociology, you would see that when Black history is taught, it's usually taught through the principles of conflict theory, never the consensus theory. So it looks at when Africa was shattered, colonized, when the enslavement period comes in. And if you were to ask any person about Black history, this is the period they will focus on. And usually within the last 500 years, which is the last chapter in our experience. So we have to be much wider. And what archaeological evidence is showing us through excavations, okay, and what DNA is telling us is that we as a group of people, or as a cluster group, are the oldest people to walk the planet, which means we're the first people to walk, talk, read, write, observe the planetary systems, okay? The first person to have labor, a menstrual cycle, the first person to have a headache, okay? When we take it back to its right, the rudimentary beginnings, right to the core of human evolution before human diffusion. This is what we begin to understand really and truly about our ancient ancestors, because there's only one family, and that is the human family. Unfortunately, through time and space, many people have come in and tried to destroy that in some way. So those principles of polarities were then put into conflict. The rich versus the poor, the strong versus the weak. One is supposed to help the other. But unfortunately, through time and space, and as far as history is concerned, those things have developed into some of the most negative experiences that people actually go through in today's society. So when we're looking at asking questions, who is history about? I was on the radio, when was it last week, and I listened to the recording, and they said, well, should we get rid of Black history? Should there not be a Black History Month? And my simple answer was that basically, to us, Black history is a daily experience. Unfortunately, during colonization and the enslavement period, we were made to become a footnote in the experiences of the imperialists. And that's what that basically came about. So when we're talking about Black History Month, we're trying to recover ourselves and put us back into the pages of history where we were physically torn out and relegated to a peripheral or a pariah entity within human society and human development. So who is history about? So we always have to look at the polarities. We have to look at those people who are the victors and those people who are the losers. What is history about? Why is history about what it is? So we have to always read between the lines. A good historian reads between the lines and studies people. Not like what colonial administrators did, because the field of anthropology actually started off by colonial administrators. And those of you who come from research departments who understand, observation, field work, etc. One of the things was that they believed at the time, which is a positivist perspective, that if you were to look at a particular person from afar, you can use your cultural ethics to interpret that person's behavior. This is ethnocentrism now. We know this now. So for instance, if two people are fighting, for instance, if you're from a far distance, etc., are they actually fighting or are they actually playing? And this is why participant observation later on became an important factor in the fields of anthropology. So the reality is that the colonial administrators were the first people that went in to study people, especially people in Africa, to report back to the colonial office in order to understand how they could control them. So the first historians, were colonial administrators, as far as an anthropological aspect is concerned, or the anthropological field. This is how this comes about. So these are some of the things I need to emphasize while I get into my presentation. So when we look at history, we know that the word history comes from his story. So it's been male-dominated through the centuries. While about my story, which is the other polarity, that is where they used to believe that the word mystery comes from. But unfortunately, through history, women are being kept out of the narrative when they're the foundations of a society. So the reality is, what about history? What about history? And what has taken place, especially since the 1960s, with the civil rights movement, with the liberation movement, etc., women were forced to put their things on the map, to put their things into the academy, their experiences. This is what this was really and truly about. So they had to fight to put themselves back in history. Just like Black people had to fight to put themselves back in history. Poor people had to fight to put themselves back in history. So all different groups who have lost some ground within the past have had to fight in some way in order to put themselves back at the center. So there's history, my story or mystery. Her story must be within those polarities. If you look at prehistory, for instance, one of the things you will notice, you've got all these different Venuses. The Venus of Wellendorf, as an example, which was found in Austria or Germany, probably Austria section, which dates back to approximately between 30 to 40,000 years ago. When Africans were caught in Europe through the migrations, etc., they were creating these things from bones, etc. And the thing I wanted to bring to your attention is that all these figurines you see that is dated back to 20 and 30 and 40 and 50,000 years in Europe and in Asia, in Eurasia, and all these places, are females, not males, are females. So what is that telling us about antiquity? What is that telling us about the prehistoric period? That we see more images of females, big-breasted, with big buttocks and all these other type of things, these Venuses. Why are there more female Venuses than male Venuses? There's hardly any male Venuses in actual fact. So what was man doing 30, 40, 50,000 years ago? How were women being treated? They must have been revered for statues to be made of them, for us to dig up during these archaeological excavations which is taking place around the world. So there was a time where women were at the center of narratives, especially in the prehistoric time. They may not have been written scripts, but we got the physical evidence, the artifacts to show us, so we can read into it, that there must have been some conviviality between the male and the female, and the boy and the girl. That's what it had to have been. And this is important for us to try to recover history. Because as a historian, I'm a recoverist. I'm trying to put those missing pages back in. Even though I specialize in the Black and the African experience, I'm pretty good in other people's experience as well. Because Africans were the first people in our society, so I have to study them before, genetic mutation take place, before the pigmentation started reducing their bodies because of the colder climates they were moving into. And then, so for me, This is important. World history. So when I'm talking about Black history was something that we were relegated to. And the thing is, if you go to any bookshop, especially in Cardiff, say for instance, go into Waterstones or Blackwell's and have a look at the history section and see which ethnic group, racial group, community or nation is in the history section. And then have a look on the peripheral aspects of those bookshops or those bookstores and see where people like myself are placed. And then you'll realize that this concept of a Black history or a Black History Month was socially constructed by people who became the imperialists at a certain time. So they were the ones who write in the narrative. So we were not a part of history. This is what this is about. So let's look at the birth of Eurocentrics. So there's Charles Montesquieu, who was a philosopher. And this is where the defamation of Black people starts to begin. This is around about the 1700s, where he says about this. But I want to focus your attention on the yellow fonts, okay? These creatures, this is how he refers to Africans, or these Negroes, because that's what we were called back then. These creatures are all over Black, and with such a flat nose, okay? So he's emphasizing a phenotype here because it's not a phenotype of the Europeans. Because after 1492, when the Moors were destroyed, this is when we see European hegemony starting to rise. And then we start to see where darker skinned people were now made into a footnote in their history. It was a way of trying to whitewash everything. This is what really started taking place. So he says these creatures are all over Black, and with such a flat nose that they are scarcely be pitied. In other words, you can't distinguish between which one is which. They all look the same. This is a 1700s language, the 18th century language. It is hardly to believe that God, who is a wise being, should place a soul, especially a good soul, in such a black, ugly body. So here we start to see the characterization of dark-skinned people taking place because of the social positioning they were within particular nations. This is how it came about. This was a science at the time, even though it's pseudoscience now, because people were educated and they had these particular theories which they were trying to pass off as facts, which was justifying to some extent the colonization, the imperialistic objective, okay, and the enslavement of people. So those people who were involved in making a hell of a lot of money can justify to themselves and can live with themselves. This is what this was about. So the likes of Charles Montesquieu is a prime example. Then you have David Hume, who's supposed to be the father of Scottish Enlightenment. And this is what he says about dark-skinned people. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even an individual eminence, either in action or speculation. In other words, in their behavior and their thinking process, speculation, thought. This is what he's talking about. No genius manufacturers, which means we did nothing to do with technology, even though there's flint and there's a metallurgical trade in prehistoric times, okay? This is a complete dismissal. Among them, no art, no sciences. And this is a load of rubbish. Archaeological digs and excavations are showing that this is not true. And even within the modern cultures of many Black people, whether in Africa or Australia, because you check this out, which countries are dug more by archaeologists? Black countries or dark-skinned countries or white-skinned countries? Because they need to look at their past. Their past is in other nations. Okay, Africa is dug up more than any other continent, and not just for their minerals and commodities and resources, but also for what? Also for the so-called treasures of the earth. Okay, this is what archaeology is based on. You know, the treasures of the earth. You know, finding things and trying to understand the past. This is what it's all about. So why are they going there? If there are people of nothing, why are you going there to dig? And they're finding out things 20,000 years, 30,000 years, 40,000 years old. So we have to think about this. Then we got Arnold Toynbee, a British historian. And this is just a quote. He did a lovely volume of history. I can't remember the amount of volumes which he did, but he was revered to be one of the best historians in the 20th century. The black race has not helped to create any civilization whatsoever. This is his belief, and people fell for that. People believed that. In Oxford and Cambridge, this is what was taught. When black history or the black experience was taught at the universities, it was called what? Colonial studies. That's what black history was called, colonial studies. So it was clear, you can see from colonial studies to black history, how we were marginalized, how we were put on the periphery, how we were polarized, not just socially, but literarily speaking. And then why African History and Black History Month? And I've just given you a little sample of what is taking place for why we are today. Okay, Black History Month started around about the 1930s in America by Carter G. Woodson, who was a second graduate of Harvard University. Okay, the second black graduate of Harvard University, because you know about racial segregation, and black people weren't allowed to have an education. Even amongst my people who live in Jamaica, we were controlled by the British until we had independence in 1962. But I come from four grandparents who were still alive when I was around. My grandmother who was a great teacher of mine, she couldn't read or write. She was born in the 1800s. I have that type of connection with the past. I used to sit and listen to her stories, etc. She was telling me she was still a slave. But wait a minute, I thought slavery was abolished in the 1830s. But you're saying you're still a slave? So what I started to realize, there are two narratives here. One person saying one thing and one person saying another. So we have to understand how this split, how this polarization between us versus them came about. So here, David Hume, David Hume thinks that we didn't create any civilizations. It was all white. These are all the civilizations in Africa. Do you see the problem now? These are and these are some of them. The Yoruba civilization, classical Kemet. You know, it was called Egypt by the Greeks. Kemet means the black lands. Okay, that's how the people refer to themselves. Then you got Kush. Okay, you got Ethiopia. Ethiopia is a Greek word, which means burnt face or black face people. So they were influenced somewhat. If you look at the Odyssey and the Iliad, they talk about Ethiopia, but not Ethiopia, the country. Africa was called Ethiopia. It meant the dark-faced people, burnt-faced people. This is what it meant. So David Hume, Montesquieu, okay, what we have to say about this, that you've lied. You have lied. And the fact is, these lies have been perpetrated to such an extent that when people from these communities are trying to tell them about their past, because, you know, imperialism has an attitude that I know more about you than you know about me. I know more about you, like Egyptology, for instance. They're trying to say that they know more about classical Egypt and Egypt's past, more than the indigenous people of that country, the black people of Egypt. They're not even part of the archaeological team unless they're digging, okay? This is where we have put down, so other people have come in and they are creating our narrative or owning our narrative. And this is unfortunate. We have our own story to tell because we were telling it before. So Asa Iliad was a chematologist. He looked at the major kingdoms of ancient Egypt, which was when he looked at when it was called Kemet, black people, when the ancient Egyptians were indigenous African people. He says that as a result of colonization, imperialism, enslavement, these were the 5 ways that the Europeans, unfortunately, decide to break us away from a tradition. They try to destroy, distort, suppress, falsify, and to intentionally confuse. So when they couldn't destroy things, okay, they distorted it, you know, and they couldn't distort it, they suppressed it, they hid it away from people. The real museums, if you go to any museum on the world, whether it's America, whether it's Britain or France or Germany, the real museum is in the basement. That's where the real museum is. So what are they hiding? Why are they suppressing this stuff? One of the opportunities I had when I was working at Cardiff University, I decided, I'm not a geneticist, but I decided to run a course, Race and Genetics. And the only reason was, while I was there, I was looking at a lot of information, a lot of old works I was reading through. I taught myself craniology, how to tell from looking at a person's head, what race and ethnicity they were. I was very meticulous in studying. I was self-taught, and I brought this into the race and genetics course. Then I started to find out with many of the archives which was there that a lot of it was being suppressed. It spoke highly of many African cultures, but it was there, it was put into a storeroom, etc. I was able to access it, but I used it and I gave it back to the people. So the suppression was something which they did in order, because they couldn't distort it, so they would hide it from people, to falsify it and to intentionally confuse. Now, when the Afrocentric movement began in the 1960s, they called the approach that the imperialists did in falsifying or distorting information, what they called it scientific colonialism. And they said there were three basic principles: unsophisticated falsification, which means you tell an outright lie; integrated modification, that's when you integrate the lie, the falsehood, the myth, the truth, okay? And you integrate it together. Integrated modification. And the last one is conceptual incarceration, where you are locked into that thinking because it's the minds which they want. Like Steve Biko once said, what is the most potent weapon into the hands of the oppressor? The minds of the oppressed. This is why, if many of you are as old as me, one of the things, if you remember what took place during the apartheid movement, they wanted to change the curriculum. They wanted to force the Black South Africans, who are the oldest people in the world, mind you, they're L1. They're the oldest cluster group of people that DNA has discovered. These people. And when these Dutch/German groups of people went in and adopted the Nazi rhetoric for an African country in order to call it apartheid, and all those people who are victorious allowed that to happen, and people bleeding. They were executing kids and torturing children. The children walked up to the classrooms. They basically said, we're not going to be taught in Afrikaans. Afrikaans is not a language, and Afrikaans is not your language. Why are you treating us the way you're treating us? Calling yourselves after what we call ourselves to give yourself legitimacy in the country. And you're telling us that we cannot, in our tradition, we're not allowed to speak our tongue. We're supposed to go to your school, and you're going to give us the education, that you're giving your own people. And it's about memory. They want the memory. Once your memory is gone, you don't know who you are. This is why memory and history is really important, because history is in everything. History is in everything. So here, you got two individuals here. You got on the left-hand side, Theophile Obenga. And on the right, you've got Anta Diop. On the right, Anta Diop was from Senegal, French. The first black Egyptologist, okay, who studied at the Sorbonne University in France. Okay, this man is a multi-genius, just like him, Hopton. Okay, he was a multi-genius. He was a physicist. That was his background, physicist. And when he went to Egyptology as his doctorate, etc., they refused to allow him his thesis to be passed. He had to do his thesis 3 times because they would not accept a black Egypt. Egypt is an African country. Even though the people may not look African, it is an African country. When they couldn't take Africans out of Egypt, they decided to take Egypt out of Africa and put it in the Middle East. You only can do that in your mind. Conceptual incarceration. Okay, this is what it's about. Integrated modification. So the reality of this situation, that he was trying to put the missing piece. He's from Senegal. He's from Africa. He knows his history. He knows his history. He knows about the ancient Egyptians, who they really were. He was a linguist as well. Okay, and he created something which is called the melanin dosage test. Okay, where you create this chemical where you can put in a mummy. All you need is 1/4 of a millimeter of skin of a mummy, and it will tell you how much pigmentation or melanin is in that skin. As soon as the Egyptologists knew about this, they decided to put it underground, all these mummies, because they like to put this on display. The only people they like to put on display are dark-skinned people. So how would people feel if I was to say, well, look, one day in a couple thousand years' time, we're going to take back control. One of the first things I think we should do is let's dig up Queen Elizabeth and Queen Victoria and put them on display in African universities in 2,000 years' time. Could you fathom that? Could you imagine that? But this is what, we were just mere objects. This is how we're seen. We know that they must be African people to put them on display. They don't even treat theirs like that. So this is the reality. This is what he did. And Theophile Obenga is a philosopher. This man speaks 8 languages, and not just 8 languages. He's from the Congo, Theophile Obenga, and he speaks classical Greek, classical Latin. This is what this man does. These 2 people were invited to a conference, a UNESCO conference in 1974 in Cairo, okay? And there's a report that these 2 men wiped the floor with these white Egyptologists, what they had in there. They proved who the ancient Egyptians were. This is what they were able to do. And it was the first time in history that they decided to invite Africans to a conference to talk about Africa, because it's always done by Europeans, similar to the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885. What took place then? You had a bunch of European men who represented a particular nation who was there to carve up Africa for its resources, for its minerals, for its commodities. This is what it was about. Not a single African leader was there at the splicing up, the splitting up, the partitioning of Africa. So this is important for us to understand. So these people are recoverists in a sense. They're there to recover their own history because they saw the cultural links. It's just not working. Hold on a second. Okay, so here. So these were the things which proved who the ancient Egyptians were. Physical anthropology, craniology. The skulls which they found were dolichocephalic, okay? Long, elongated skulls. These are African skulls, according to the classification of within craniology. Human images, majority of them are dark-skinned. And they, you know, they are indigenous. They are light-skinned people. Sometimes the different skin colors was to represent certain other things, which is something I can get into maybe next week or the week after. The melanin dosage test was the clencher. The mummies all tested with high levels of melanin. The same quantity of melanin that you find in what they refer to as sub-Saharan Africa. Subhuman, subordinate. Why are we calling it this? To split it off from what they would call white Africa. They don't call it white Africa, but that is what's left in the mind. Because they say black Africa, then, you know, which means there must be a white Africa. No, it's just Africa. And Africa is a continent, not a country. And they've got people within the continent speaking like this now. So they've changed the narrative. Osteological evidence, looking at the bones, the skeletal remains of the people. Okay, eyewitness account, the Greeks said they were there. The Greeks were there. Remember, the Greeks came to Africa to study at the foot of the ancient Kemetic people. That's where they got philosophy from and took that back. And then when Alexander came there, he respected to some degree the knowledge and the wisdom that these groups of people had. But there was high witness. Herodotus is criticized that he was seeing things, etc. But he knew if he saw the black-skinned person, he saw the dark-skinned person. Why are we, so many thousand years later, trying to undo what he did? But yet he's the father of history. He's not the father of history when he started saying things that didn't coincide with the colonial project, with the imperialist project. Then he looked at linguistic unity. He started to notice that the ancient Kemetic language, or Egyptian language, okay, had large affinities and relationships with West African languages. And the name of the country, which they call it, was Kemet, the Blacklands. They were trying to say it's a black soil. But if you read Medunetia, or what the Greeks call hieroglyphics, if you read Kemetu, that's what they call it, Kemetu. There's a man sitting there. They're talking about the people. Okay, because they use pictographs. So there's no, you know, escaping the reality of what they called themselves and why they called themselves. Dark skin, black was not a stigma for them. It's something that they embraced. So this is just an idea of telling you who they were and how history has been distorted over the years. This was found in the tomb of Ramses III, okay, 1200 BC. The A character is how the Egyptians see themselves. And if you look at the C character, it's identical. And if you even look at the sides, if you even look here, you've actually got a person sat down, Kemetu. So what's that telling us? The black person, they name their country after themselves, and over the soil. after themselves. The Assyrians named their country after themselves. The Greeks named it after themselves. But when it comes to Africans now and the highest culture in classical history, oh, it must be the soil. These are the games which have been playing. What Asa Hilliard says, falsification or suppression or to distort or to destroy. And in order to intentionally confuse what? Is conceptual incarceration. This is what this is about. And we have to look beyond these things. Research now is so complex to a large extent that we are finding out things that we never knew before, because we're now using a different eye, a different type of observation that we've never used before. Because the types of observation that we had before was based upon what? It was based upon the culture we came from. We were influenced by the beliefs and the morals and the customs and the norms and the values of the people that we come from. And then when we're looking through a magnifying glass, we couldn't see what we're supposed to see. It blinded us. We had to come out of that to try to be more objective. But this is what they said. So they had no problem. A didn't have a problem relating himself with the rest of Africans, which is C. And they showed this in antiquity. What the other two groups look like. B is who? The Indo-European, the Hittite types of people. And D is the Semitic. These are people who came down from the ice, okay? Came down into the equatorial regions, mixed. That's how they got their color, because they'd still some pigment in their skin, as you can see. Maybe not as dark as the Egyptian or the rest of Africans, but yet they are an amalgamation, okay? They are miscegenated, they're a mixture. So these are some books which are out to attack asking people around the world. You've got Not Out of Africa, written by Mary Lefkowitz, where she's basically trying to say that Africans haven't contributed anything to world history and science. And if the Greeks said they studied in Egypt, under the Africans, it may not be that type of African and all this other type of nonsense. This is what's coming out now from the classical period, because the Greeks and the Romans acknowledged, where they got their information from. Because the reality is the Mediterranean is closer to Africa, not to the Nordics, not in Northern Europe. That's where it touched them. You know, the ancient Phoenicians, who were known as Canaanites before the Greeks called them Phoenicians. Yeah, they were seafarers traveling around, and they went into those places in the Mediterranean. Ancient Egyptians, we can look at the Carthaginian Empire and so on. Sumerian Empire was a black empire, which I'm going to show you and prove to you. Because they say, well, the language was not Indo-European, and it certainly ain't Semitic. But the word Sumer comes from the word blackheads. That's what the word Sumer comes from. And this is where we get the word summer, which would mean heat. So it was all to do with climate and skin color. Then you got Black Athena, because a white person by the name of Martin Burnell wrote a 3-volume book, which he's going to call African Athena. Because when you look at the classical work, he started to realize that a lot of what the classical world was saying, you can find in Africa. So that's why they called it Black Athena. You want to call it African Athena, but the publisher said, no, it won't sell. The word Africa in the title won't sell. So you got to call it Black Athena. So you can see how people's been conditioned over the years, where black has been considered negative, but yet at the same time, it's associated with the people. Then you've got the end of racism. End of racism is basically saying that racism ended. It doesn't give us a date, a month, and a year, but he's basically saying that racism has ended. And he's talking it from American perspective. He does look at the British system, but he's talking from American perspective. This couldn't be further from the truth. Conceptual incarceration, okay? Unsophisticated falsification is a lie. Then they integrate, they modify it. They integrated it by modification. And then conceptual incarceration. And this is what it is. Like Steve Biko said, the most potent weapon in the person who oppresses you is your mind. And this is what it's about. So we have to think outside our box. Unfortunately, some of our cultures are sick to a large degree, but we have to look outside our cultures in order to get a better eye and vision of how history really and truly is. And then you've got the bell curve, which came out, which is supported. This is in most of the universities, basically saying, oh, dumb black people are through IQ test, which is culturally biased. Because what? Because all IT, when you look at IQ tests, it focuses primarily on the European culture. Other people got their own culture. Culture is very idiosyncratic. That's how culture is. It has its own particularities and specificities. So how can you use your culture as a monitoring factor, as a barometer to judge this one? It doesn't work like that. Culture evolves based upon environment, based upon understanding, based upon the religious beliefs that people have. So these are the books that really attack the existence of dark-skinned people, and this is the reason why we have to have a Black History Month, because these things have, have incarcerated, conceptually incarcerated mankind to the point where when we do talk about positive things about what we do, they said we're teaching good feeling, good sense of feeling, and to motivate ourselves and all that other type of thing. When other people do it, it's fine. When we do it, it's not so fine. So this is the British Empire. Some say it's about a third of the world, some say it was a quarter, but this was the British Empire. So let's have a look what takes place. During the period of empire, racism permeated every field of intellectual life in Britain. In no field was its influence more pervasive or more pernicious than historiography. Children and young people were taught a version of history which idolized and glamorized Britain. So everyone's complaining now about Picton and Colston, all these statues coming down. They idolized and glamorized Britain. These were killers, oppressors. I know, and this is the thing, the people who see them as part of our heritage. What type of heritage is that? Is this the people that you revere, you put up? Are you serious? They've killed thousands of people in the name of what? In the name of kingdom, in the name of empire, imperialism? We have to look at that. And these people are erected up in town centers and all these other places, etc. So you can see what's happening. The more brutal an individual seems to be, is the more they revere them and they want to make them into statues. Mainly men, mainly men. But that is a changing of history. So if that's your best, if the likes of Colston, who was a slave merchant who used to rape women, and the other one, Picton, who did a similar thing, and you should read the story of what he was doing in Trinidad. And you're getting upset about that, then you're conceptually incarcerated. You've allowed people to take your brain. You're not looking at the wider picture, because you would not revere those people in the 21st century and make them into monuments. You would not do that. You would not do that. But they were men of their time. What is that supposed to mean? There are many men who lived in the same time who didn't engage in those type of practices. So what are you actually saying? You're trying to justify that behavior, that genocidal mentality that these people had? So this is what came out of empire, unfortunately. People in this country were made to worship at the foot of empire. And I know this because my parents were West Indian. They were so proud of Britain. They called it the mother country. My grandmother was proud. They didn't know very much. My grandmother was a bit different because she was a slave and she was born in the 1800s. I only saw her for the first 7-8 years of my life. There's many of you can't even say who were sat in this room that they have a relative who they spoke to who was born in the 1800s. Most of your relatives were born in the early part of the 20th century. So that's what makes me a bit unique and a bit more of authority when I'm looking at this, because I had it from the mouth of somebody who lived at that particular period. It may have been the last few years of the 1800s, but it's still the 1800s. This is what is important here, okay? And obviously it says it portrays Black people as inferior. So evil people from evil empire are considered good, etc. But we were portrayed as being inferior. Inferior based upon what? Just skin color? Is that your barometer for judgments? And unfortunately, that's how it was. Most of the respected names in British 19th century historiography were racist, and most of them reflected in their writings racist ideology. Peter Fryer, there's his book there. It's an excellent book. It's an old book. I think he wrote that either in the late 70s, early 80s, But this was the reality of Britain at the time. People were worshipping, imperialism. It made them feel good. But unfortunately, many of them didn't realize the type of atrocities that were being carried out in the name of empire, the name of crown, in the name of king or queen or country or whatever the case may be. Then books, which was in school when I was there. This is supposed to be a book I was supposed to read as a 7-8-year-old as part of my reading comprehension, and a book in which they really and truly believed was basing, what am I trying to say here? Trying to improve race relations. Okay? The 10 little niggers. Right. They're telling little niggers here, they're talking about children. They're talking about children. This is a children, we're talking about children, okay? So when there was inferiority complexes coming about through literature and children and teachers didn't understand, is because they were incarcerated conceptually, as Afrocentrics would say, because they modified the evil things and integrated it together to make it fair seeming to them, make it seem okay to them. This was the book I was given, and there was no, there was no blink of an eye or nothing, because it was normalized at the time. I was given this book in 1975, 1976 to read. That was their contribution to some element of multicultural education at the time. Then we have another one, Enid Blyton, okay? Died 1963. This was another book which was written, a children's book as well, which went round all through the empires. Because what you have to understand about these books, and let me just take this back, those books stretched all over the empire, not just in Britain, all over the empire, okay? And remember, some of the colonies are here. These are the Caribbean islands. You could just about make out the red. The book flooded in all these places. So don't be surprised when, you know, it's entrenched within culture and people cannot move away from that. So this is what it was. So this is the type of literature which they had. So they were attacking kids. You had adults who have a moral authority attacking children in their literature. This is what imperialism is about. Then you have this book written by the same author again, okay? Let's have a look what Peter Fryer says. In Enid Blyton's The Little Black Doll, first published in 1937 and reissued in 1965. A doll's black face is a feared stigma which has to be removed before this doll can be accepted by other toys, which means they're talking about kids now, because dolls don't move, dolls don't speak, okay? Dolls don't feed themselves. They're talking about kids. This is classical conditioning. Okay, but they used toys to camouflage and to cover it up. We knew who they were talking about, but the kids, our peers in school, our white young peers in school didn't understand. You're getting sensitive, you're getting emotional. It doesn't mean that, it's just a toy, it's just a story. You know, come on. This is what conceptual incarceration did to people because of what was falsified and modified. Okay, the doll has to suffer, act as a servant, okay, as a slave, and undergo ritual purification by water. Ritual purification by water. What does that mean? Because of his dark skin, to wash it off. Once he has become pink, he can't become white, see, because he's too dark, so he has to be pink, because white means purity. Instead of black, he is a nice doll now, okay, as good as any other, and thinks that the toys, meaning children, read between the lines, okay? Toys will perhaps like him now. He is no longer different. So don't be surprised when we see things like this happening. The only person I'm going to speak about is Nicki Minaj. She's from the Caribbean. Her parents and grandparents had this literature. Look how she's bleached herself. This is ritual purification taking place right in front of us. There's a difference of opinion whether Michael Jackson did it or not. He may have had this skin disease. He may have. You know, some people say, well, no, that's not the case. But we know what he did with his phenotype on his face. His lips got a bit thinner. His nose got a bit narrower. Okay? So in reality, this is what happens. It starts off when you're a child. So don't be surprised when you have an inferiority complex as an adult, it goes back to childhood. This is what child developmental psychology and sociology is teaching us. Then you got the Clarke and Clarke study. Sorry, it shouldn't be without the E's. Okay, that's my mistake there. 1939. This is 2 years after Enid Blyton had wrote her book, you know, The Little Black Doll. 2 years after, okay? This study comes together. So there was a lot to do with, when they were writing in the colonial empire, they're writing about toys and dolls and ridiculing dark-skinned people. This is how they were doing it. They're trying to be clever, trying to floss it or hide it in some way. So Mamie Clarke, because she played with little white dolls, etc., she wanted to conduct these doll studies. However, it was her husband who took it further. And most of you who know history know that in 1954, it was the Brown versus the Board of Education, where they desegregated schools within the United States of America. And what that basically meant was that black kids could now be integrated into white schools if they lived in close areas. But the problem what the government did was close down black schools and put them in and bus them to white schools. This is not what they wanted. What they wanted, if black children live close, 2 minutes from a white school, they should be admitted into that school. That's what they wanted. Okay. Now, what made this case successful was looking at the psychological impact that black children had within schools based upon these dull studies. Okay, he used the dull studies in the Brown versus the Board of Education to prove his point of what segregated schools did to black children. Even though there was other nuances within American society, he was perpetuating and permeating that reality. And what was that? Billboards, tabloids, movies, films, and the list just goes on and on. It was reinforced in all these different types of institutions. So this is what takes place. So Clarke and Clarke, 1939. Clarke and Clarke in 1947. This is when they decided to conclude and write up their reports. Okay, they were psychologists, both of them. One of the earliest black psychologists in America, because the American Psychological Association, a psychiatric association, was segregated. Black people couldn't be a part of that. And that is one of the reasons why we got the black psychologists or psychological unions and all these other things in America, because of racial segregation. Okay, Clarke and Clarke in 1947 found that black children preferred white dolls and rejected black dolls when asked which were nice, which looked bad, which they would like to play with, and which was a nice color. This suggested that black children had negative attitudes towards themselves and their cultural background. Themselves and cultural background, they hated who they were and where they came from. This is deadly. And this is what we have to understand about the importance of the stimulus. What stimulus is it out there that we are responding to? What are we taking in the back of our minds? And this is what happens when the victors take over, they demean the people who lost. Then we had this one here. This was done about 10 years ago. She won a lot of money on the Oprah Winfrey show. She was between 15 and 17, this young African-American girl, okay, who made this documentary. It was called A Girl Like Me. I think that might be her. She got a white doll and a black doll with her, but she saw them both the same. This was just a picture that was just happened to be taken. I'm not sure the person who took the picture told her to choose which doll, and she said she'll have them both. She said she'll have them both. This is what this picture tells us, and pictures tell us a lot of words. The first elements of a script in any form were pictographs, historically. This is how people started off writing before it became the so-called script or letters that we understand today. So from the study, she decided to go into an inner city play group or something and carry out the study. It was clear that she had to get consent from parents and all the rest of stuff. And then this is what happened as a result. 15 out of 21 black children in the 21st century chose the white doll, based upon the questions that Clarke and Clarke had posed earlier. She replicated the same study. So what has happened in America? What has happened in America for an average child to feel traumatic or suicidal about who and what they are? So let's have a look. I think I'll go on for another 10 minutes. Yeah, I think. Should I go on? Should I have a break now, or what's the situation now, Abid? Are you there?
You've got till 1:30. Might be best to have a break now.
Yeah, okay, we'll have a break now and we could come back, yeah?
Okay, so just coming up to 10 to if we come back together at 7 o'clock.
Yeah, you can put the record on now. So there's a typo in this, so I do recognize. Right, Orlando Patterson is a Jamaican sociologist who works at Harvard University in America. I'm not sure if he's still alive, but he's done some monumental works in many, many different things, especially looking at the condition of Black people, especially over the last 500 years, their integration into society, how they fare within the labor market, looking at different types of polarizations, whatever the case may be. Now, this is what he believed in 1972 when he was looking at the way in which Black history was taught within the Western world, he noticed there were 3 different approaches that came out. And this is what I'm going to be dealing with in the next coming week: the catastrophic, contributionism, and the survivalist. Okay, so the catastrophic mainly looks at the way in which ancient as well as modern invaders came into Africa, destroyed elements of cultures and monuments and all these other type of things. That's one thing which Europeans mainly focus on when they look at Black history or African history. Their favorite one, because it's more modern, etc., is looking at the survivalist approach. And that is looking at the ways in which Black people or African people were taken into the so-called New World, they were abused, and then they had to fight for self-determination, they had to fight for freedom, and all these other type of things. But if you notice those 2 approaches, they fall into the aspect of the conflict theory, okay, the conflict theory, where there's always disputes. And even Carter G. Woodson himself said that whenever Black history is taught within the American Academy, it's always taught as Black people being a problem. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of people have some issues with, you know, Black history, especially when they're dealing with contributionism. And this is where the Afrocentric movement now like to focus on. Because Europeans or the imperialists have focused on the negative aspects after our so-called destruction, which has been a contributing factor by themselves. The reality is that when we are looking at the positive aspects of those different empires and whatever the case may be, people saying that we're trying to clutch onto straws and we're trying to make ourselves feel good and all these other type of things. Like we don't have permission to have our own narratives about who we are. Who makes other people the experts of who we are? The people who destroyed it? That makes them the experts. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. However, through historical understandings, through archaeological evidence and all these other type of things, we begin to realize that a lot of the truth is now coming to the surface. Asa Iliad, who's a chematologist, like I said, he was an educational psychologist and a historian. This is what he says: there is something dreadfully wrong with an educational socialization process that leaves us ignorant of our past, strangers to our people, apes of our oppressors. I want to focus on those 3. So when you have an academy which teaches education and a home socializes you, even though education institutions is a secondary form of socialization, the primary socialization is at the home. And what he's basically saying here is that if the educational system or your home system leaves you ignorant of your past, you don't know what happened before. And this is what happened with my parents' or grandparents' generation. They very ignorant about their past and knew more about Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth, the Stuarts, the Tudors, etc. Okay, ignorant of our past. Strangers to our people. You don't even know where you belong or who you belong to. And apes of our oppressors, because this is how a lot of the people within the colonial world at that time started to see Black people as apes. They talked about jungles. You know, if you understand classical conditioning and pairing, you'll notice that when you say certain things, a certain person comes to mind. And this is what happens. If you would have said terrorism 30 years ago, the first thing that would come on your mind was Irish people. Okay, this is how we were conditioned. You know, Irish people were the terrorists. Now, I say terrorists in the 21st century is another group of people that you focus on. So the reality is that words can reduce a person to an object. So this is the kind of objects they reduced this to. This is what they believed, because evolution started to come out, the theory of evolution, etc. So this is important for us to realize. If we track things back in time, we will begin to understand our role in perpetuating the ideological crimes that was put upon particular people who were victims or innocent. Otto Obenga, he came from the Congo, the pygmy man. He was supposed to be the missing link. Okay, he was supposed to be the missing link. This was just before the Piltdown Man came out, and he was actually put in the Bronx Zoo. He was put in there practically, he was actually put in the cage, but naked. He had to urinate and defecate in front of people. And when he came to the zoo as a specimen, the amount of people that came there to see him as this so-called missing link was unbelievable. They made millions by putting him on display. So this is how people started to see Black people at that particular time, as animals. okay, and see us as animals. And then it went even further in the entertainment industry. You had the likes of Josephine Baker, one of the best dancers of her time. And she used to do this thing called the banana dance, okay, to associate with monkeys and apes. And this was coming on. Even King Kong was based upon that. The King Kong story that you know was based upon Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson was the black heavyweight, okay, who had a fascination for white women and used to go into segregated restaurants and sit there and eat because people were too scared to say anything to him. He had the audacity to do that during racial segregation. He was a tough individual. He was really, really tough. And that's what it's about. And the part where he's climbing up the building with the white woman, etc., and then he gets killed, he drops. This is what we will do to you if you become upwardly mobile. When he was climbing on the Empire State Building, this is what we'll do. There's symbolisms in the movie. And black people back at the time, we were well aware of that. We were well aware that who Planet of the Apes was when that came out on the 1960s. Black Americans, we know who it was. And this is what they were doing. Because things were changing, they were trying to hide behind things. Before that, they were using toys. Now they were using, you know, animals. And there's it again, you know, to act like an ape, even legs being wide, etc. This would never be allowed at that time in Hollywood because they were still, to a large extent, a conservative society. So there's Asa Hilliard again, looking at what you call it. He's been interviewed. There was a program in the 1980s called For the People. And what they would do, they would get black scholars from different fields, psychologists, sociologists, economists, etc., to be interviewed on particular things. And this is what it was said. Dr. Hilliard, and this is what Milton says. Dr. Hilliard, as a psychologist and historian, what does it mean to be black in America from a psycho-historical perspective? Well, you have to realize that slavery had two components. One was a physical component and the other was mental, physical and mental. And the physical slavery always had to be backed up with mental slavery. Mental slavery was achieved by slave masters by deliberately calculating to do several things. One was to destroy the memory of a people to be enslaved, or else physical slavery would not stick, okay? The other was to destroy the sense of group identity, okay? Group identity, or else unity was possible and slavery would be difficult. And he goes on to say, basically, that it'd be difficult and they wouldn't be able to conquer the people, whatever the case may be. So it's about divide and conquer. This is what he's literally saying. It's about divide and conquer. And as a psychologist studying the American experience, not the black experience, the American experience, this is what he started to understand. And if you watched it For the People, you can watch this on YouTube and you have, look at some of the stuff that he presents. He looks at the way in which black people advertise on toothpaste and on soap powder and all these other things, with caricatures, thick lips and all these other type of things, being ridiculed within cartoons, okay? So this has been a long process. And what you have to understand as well, as observers and as students of history, is that we refused education. After the fall of the Moors in 1492, and then the setting up of enslavement, the enslavement system in the so-called Americas, we were denied reading and writing for 5 centuries. We weren't allowed to read and write. If a black person in the Americas was caught reading and writing, it was death. It was death. Then you had articles like this, you had Vogue, okay? And LeBron James was the first black man on the front cover. So let's have a look at some of the similarities here, what they were trying to do. He didn't know, he was innocent. He was the first black person on the front cover of Vogue, etc. But when I saw this, I saw it straight away, what they were doing. And this is what it was. This is how they see black people as animals, okay? And it's in the mind of many people who draw now. People have been affected by many of the things that has taken place over the last few centuries. Okay, so here. So height denotes power. When you look at images, people who into graphic design and things like that, you would know what I'm talking about here. But height denotes power, okay? So he has a lot of, so as far as height is concerned, he's a powerful person, an influential person. The person he's with is a model. Then all of a sudden it points to his head. They look like horns. He was deliberately put there. They look like horns. He looks like a devil if you look at it clearly. Because when you put things together, images and things, everything is moved and centered and calculated in a particular place for the particular reason. Because you want the message to go out there to the person. You're trying to sell them something or influence them or convince them. Then you look at this now. So you got the thing which is culture, which is German for culture. And his culture, the black culture, is basketball. All they want to do is play. Okay? We got to look at the symbolism which is being used. And this is just one example. We know it's the mouth. LeBron James would not have opened the mouth unless they said. Many of us stand in front of photographs and they tell you to cheese, say this, say that. This is what he was told by the photographer. So they knew what they were doing. They knew what they were doing. When African Americans saw this image and they started complaining, because they knew it straight away, because they've been demonized for centuries. They were trying to say, no, it doesn't mean this and it doesn't mean that, or whatever the case may be. Even the foot, you got the black boots and the white, it's similar thing with the apes, the gorillas' foot. So it was clear that they were trying to do, they were doing it in a subliminal way, but didn't realize a lot of people were educated about what was really taking place and what was really happening. So these are some images. So when people from the black community are seeing things and you can't read things and all these other type of things, then they're taking it personal. You shouldn't be angry. Why is everything has to be about race? Everything is about race. Yeah, and that was constructed in the 1600s by those people who went to colonize the New World. It was about race for them then. You can't say to the people, no, it's not about race now, when that is the foundation of modern Western civilization and modern capitalism. You can't say this. It doesn't make sense. If you're a historian, that's the conclusion you'll have to come to. And then again, you've got the likes of Cat Williams. He was asked to do a thing on Comedy Central, with Flavor Flav. And this was what was in his script. But what he said, they didn't put it in the script when he went for the, for the dress rehearsal. It was about 2 minutes before he's supposed to announce, this is what they gave him to say. Look, it's the flying monkey. This is what, Comedy Central, this is what they were saying. And he was really upset about this. And he was right, because he knew there was something not right. And he knew they were going to give him something else to do. And just before it happened, because Flavor Flav was supposed to fly out, to end up on his chair. This is what, this was the Flavor roast. If those of you, know what the roast is where people come up and celebrities come up and ridicule the individual. You got to sit there and take it, basically. It's supposed to be fun, but it's not really that fun if you really look at it. Because sometimes they go really far, too far sometimes. And then you got images like this on the internet. So it's clear in the minds of a lot of white people that we are seen as animals. Yeah, let's make no mistake about that. So when police brutality takes place, this is why it happens in the blink of an eye. People just don't, they're desensitized. Okay, they're desensitized. They've been conditioned to such an extent that it must have been his fault. He must have been resisting arrest. He must have. But what is the problem now is that through smartphones now, a lot of things are being recorded. And that's never happened before. When the Rodney King beating took place in the 1990s, because somebody was recording it. The police have always gone off with, with all these things of brutality, etc. Now it's being recorded. They're still going to court and they're still getting off with it. They're in bed with their wives, they're kissing their kids goodnight, and nothing happened. They've just put somebody in the grave. That's the reality of Western civilization. When you demonize a person, you can literally get away with anything. And that's what's happened. And then in 2012, when the Olympics was on, this is what happened with Gabby Douglas. As soon as her thing was over, on the right part here, on the right-hand side here, you can see the ape coming up. He's going to climb up on, I don't know what you call them, okay, I'm not a gymnast, etc., to do his acrobatics or whatever the case may be. When the African-American community asked about this, they said, well, you shouldn't take it personally. It didn't mean that. Okay, so I'm trying to show you from different things. Not only males are being attacked, females are being attacked as well. So the game still goes on. And a lot of the contributing factors to this Welsh-American person who wrote this movie, Birth of a Nation. Okay, and when he wrote this Birth of the Nation, etc., it was come from a book called From the Klansman. That's what the book was called, From the Klansman. How the white Southerners are going to save the white woman from these black people after so-called liberation. Because if you know about the history of the Ku Klux Klan was formed in 1865 from disgruntled Southern soldiers from the Confederacy who lost the war against the Union. And because their former slaves are now free, there was a fear. So they wanted to put them back into slavery in some way, or they wanted to control them. So they became vigilante groups, going around lynching and all these other type of things. Because you rarely find lynchings that took place when they were enslaved and they were the property of white people. Lynching only came when they were no longer the property. Because if you were to kill the property back then or whatever, you'd be taken to court, you could be sued. That was a legal system in America and in the Caribbean. Okay, so all I want to emphasize with this particular image here, when this was shown, it was also shown in the White House. It was the first feature film. All the black characters, they say, were in blackface. So they didn't even use authentic black people for the movies. And then in Hollywood, when movies are being made in the early 20s and 30s, especially with black males, they still had to blacken up their face to play the part of a slave or whatever the case may be. So that's what it all basically came down to. But the membership of the Klan increased. So movies have a way of influencing people's behavior. So when they say the TV or movies don't influence, then we need to think again. The Klan had grown because it started to attenuate. It started to reduce its members because people weren't aware of what was really happening. Then you have these marches, etc. You don't see police there or whatever the case may be. It's part of the social fabric. Okay, it's part of the social fabric. So what I'm trying to emphasize here, the membership started to increase, and the Ku Klux Klan are still in existence even till today. It's a movement, it's a terrorist movement that has been around since 1865 and it's still in existence today. It's crazy, but that's the reality. Then we got the likes of Al Johnson, who's blacking up his face. That was another major movie. I think it was the first movie which was in color. And this is what they did. Okay, so there's something about when technology within the film industry comes about that they have to ridicule dark-skinned people. They have to be the brunt of the jokes. And then you got the Amos and Andy. For many years, people didn't know that Amos and Andy was these two white characters here, these two white Americans here. Okay, so the black in the face became a form of ridicule, a form of joking around, etc. But we find it very offensive. In Britain, it's a bit different because of the Moors, those black Moroccans, and Senegalese and Mauritanians that came over in the 10th century. There's a lot of evidence about this. They were known as what they call Black Moors. They were called Fomorians amongst the Celtic people. And they settled and they married amongst the people, etc. And then you got the thing from Moorish dancing to Morris dancing. Okay, and people started to blacken up their faces, etc., as a way of celebrating what their forefathers that came from Africa had did and established in Britain. So there is a historical thing in Britain where it is acceptable up to a certain extent. What we've seen with university students who want to blacken up their face or trying to imitate their black professor and things like that, and they feel that they're not doing anything wrong. Okay, and then you had more modern thing of Ali G, doing exactly the same. So the tradition keeps continuing. Obviously, it's not blackface, but the accent and the false Afro hair is all an element of ridicule. And if you look, what fruit is yellow and black? It's a banana. So we have to read between the lines. And hey, he's aping around. We need to read the subliminal messages. So these are just some of the things. So these are just what you call it. So these were skulls which were found. These were skulls which were found in Europe. Grimaldis. Grimaldis were people that migrated out of Africa about 70,000 years ago to settle in Europe. Okay, so what I'm trying to show you here, that these skulls are the oldest skulls which are found in Europe, and they were African people. They were African people. So we are all one family. We're one human family. So it's only through social construction why races and ethnicities have come together in these little small groups in a way to divide and conquer. Yeah. And then you had this that took place at Newsweek. This was the search for Adam and Eve. There was a study which was done in the 1980s or the late 1980s by Rebecca Kahn of the University of Hawaii and Berkeley University. And what they decided to do, they wanted to sample, they wanted to find out about the genetic lines of females, from females to females, okay, extracting mitochondrial DNA from placentas. So women who just had babies, they were going into hospitals to carry out this study. Now they chose 147 women of different shades, different colors, different ethnic groups, different languages, okay, different races. And when they put it all into the laboratory and put, you know, their calculations in, etc., what they found out that every single one of those women, okay, back in time, shared the same DNA as one woman that lived in Africa approximately 190,000 to 200,000 years ago. This is what came out of this thing, out of this study. And this is what this Newsweek was about. So he was trying, so because what archaeology has found, you know, the deeper they dig, the darker the people are. So they are the oldest people on the planet. And it's not about superiority, inferiority. Okay, it's not about superiority and inferiority. Okay, so this is how it comes. So this is the face of L0. This is mitochondrial Eve, the mother of all of us. This is how she's supposed to have looked back then. And then she gave birth to L1. Okay, they're the San people of Southern Africa. Okay, they have the epicantic fold, they're dark brown to light brown in skin color, okay, but they're the oldest people in the world on a genetic line, okay, the San people. They started calling them the Khoisan. So she gives birth then to L2, the Mbuti people of the Congo, okay, that's the next genetic line that comes, and then you've got L3, which is the Kikuyu people of Kenya. And then from that, you have M and N, which are two other genetic branches of the female branch, because mitochondrial DNA is passed from mother to daughter to mother to daughter. When it's passed to a son, it stops there. The son cannot transfer that genetic material to his son from his mother, okay? So this is an important aspect for us to acknowledge. So from the Kikuyu people, you get M and N. She has two other daughters, this person here. Some of them stay in Africa, and then the rest goes into the so-called Middle East, which is Arabia. They're supposed to have left and gone to Arabia at approximately 134 to 136,000 years ago when they went to Arabia. By the time they got to Europe, it was approximately about 70,000 years ago. The Aborigines that live in Australia got there, you know, after they migrated out, etc. Probably 60,000 years they've been there. So we are very old. So we were all over the planet, etc. Then something happened to change pigmentation, and that was to do with the worm interstadial. And the worm interstadial is basically where the Ice Age came, okay, and we had to depigment in order to survive in those climatic changes. So this is just a genetic marker. You can find your genetic footprint of showing you people migrating, the M&N sort of thing, migrating, you know, into Arabia, etc., into Asia, whatever the case may be. And then you have a similar thing of the Semitic diffusion, where the Semitic groups came out of Africa, obviously, and they settled in southwestern Arabia, okay, and they went up into, you know, up into Sumeria, what is known as Sumeria, which is modern-day Iraq. And this is how they left. So I'm trying to show you all the different forms of migration that took place. And then these are all your African groups or tribes, you know, so you've got your Central Cushitic, your Eastern Cushitic, Southern Cushitic, and then you got your Egyptians. They share the same branch with the Berbers, the African Berbers, now not the light-skinned Berbers who are from the Germanic and the Turkic people. And you've got the Chaldaic group of people, which are mainly your West African types. So this is how they branch off. And you've got the Semitic, this is linguistic evidence, linguistic diffusion now, okay? This is about language. And then obviously the Semitic language then goes into the Arabian Peninsula and then spreads. So I give you linguistic evidence, paleontological evidence, and archaeological evidence dealing with anthropology. So I give you 3 different disciplines that are saying the same thing and breaking it down. So like, again, this is the Venus of Willendorf, etc. You can see that's an African woman. They found thousands of these in Southern Africa. So those L1 that left went, and this is how they did their hair as well. If you look at the woman's hair, I won't go back to it, her hair was peppercorn hair. Peppercorn hair, that's how their hair grows amongst the San females or the San women. Okay, and this is supposed to be an African man, and this is what a lot of European paleontologists or anthropologists are stipulating, which dates back to 28 to 34,000 years old. This is much older, probably up to about 30,000 years old. Okay, but you see a lot of these female figurines all around Europe and Asia. So there must have been something happening positively for women, for men to want to create figurines of women. They must have been revered in some way. Okay, I've explained all that, about Rebecca Canister. I didn't realize I was up there. Okay, and this is how it looks here now. L1, the San people, okay, the Mbutu people, they move over here. They all start off in East Africa. The other group, the L3, the Kikuyu group, and then they all branch off and they mutate or whatever the case may be, are still in Africa. And then you got M. Okay, so M stays behind in Africa. So the M and N moves out. And then they end up still going to Australia and up to, through to the Americas or whatever the case may be. These are all genetic mutations, but they are still all African people. This is the thing, they're still African people. These people, they still are. The women's stadio hasn't happened yet. The great ice age that lasted between 15 to 20,000 years that caused Africans to depigment as a result of those chromatic changes. Okay, and then you got the Nubian Kushites. The Nubian Kushites, this is during the 25th dynasty, okay, when the Assyrians came into Egypt and they destroyed the Cushitic Nubians, etc. They ended up in the Americas. Ivan van Sertima talks about the presence of these Nubians in the Americas. And they tried to deny for decades that this was an African. They tried to make us a baby face, etc. But this was too conclusive. The 7 grays at the back. And this was very, very common amongst the Sudanic and the Ethiopic people. So it was clear these were African people that went there. So we didn't start off our history in slavery.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news.
Yeah.
It's gone 7:30.
Okay, no problem. We can continue the rest next week.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming. One of the things we've done is we've recorded this, so we'll make it available. There were some questions in the chat box, but we don't really have time to get back to that. And hopefully everyone knows that this is the first of a set of 3. I suppose what I'd like to do is to thank the members of the Student Race Equality Steering Group for managing today and for doing things like managing the Zoom. So hopefully see you all next week.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Thanks.
It's really unfair you can't hear the round of applause, can you?
No, I can't. But thanks everyone for turning up. I really appreciate you coming, and I hope that we can continue this next week. And I hope you've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Abu-Bakr.
Okay, thanks.